The fishing rod bent sharply toward the water as I watched from behind the cluster of pine trees. My sister-in-law Sarah stood at the edge of the lake, her silhouette backlit by the early morning sun. But she wasn't reeling in a catch. Instead, she carefully removed something from her pocket and tossed it into the water. Even from my hiding spot 50 yards away, I could see her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I'd followed her here after months of suspicion. Every Sunday for the past year, Sarah had disappeared at dawn with her fishing gear, returning hours later with no fish and red-rimmed eyes. My brother Mark never questioned it. He was just happy she'd found a hobby after everything they'd been through. But something about her story never added up. As I watched her now, Sarah knelt by the water's edge and unfolded what looked like a letter. She read it silently, her lips moving slightly, then kissed the paper before carefully folding it into a small paper boat. With trembling hands, she placed it on the water's surface and pushed it gently away from shore. "I miss you so much," I heard her say, her voice carrying across the still morning air. "Happy birthday, my sweet boy." My heart stopped. This wasn't about an affair or some dark secret I'd imagined. This was about Jacob, my nephew who had drowned in this very lake 3 years ago. The nephew whose name had become unmentionable in our family. The child whose death had nearly destroyed my brother's marriage and left a void no one knew how to fill. I stepped backward, a twig snapping beneath my foot. Sarah's head whipped around, her eyes widening in shock and betrayal when she spotted me. The look on her face, raw grief mixed with the humiliation of being discovered in her most private moment, is something I'll never forget. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice somehow reaching me across the distance. "How dare you follow me here?" I had invaded something sacred, violated her only space to grieve openly. And in that moment, I realized I had never truly known my sister-in-law at all. The drive home that day was the longest 30 minutes of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white as I tried to process what I'd witnessed. Sarah had left the lake immediately after spotting me, speeding past in her blue Subaru without a glance in my direction. I gave her a head start, sitting in my car for nearly an hour, disgusted with myself. Before Jacob's death, Sarah had been the vibrant center of our family gatherings. She was the one who organized the holiday meals, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who took hundreds of photos that she'd carefully arrange into albums. She'd been a kindergarten teacher, perfect for her patient, nurturing nature, until Jacob was born. Then she'd devoted herself entirely to motherhood. Jacob had been their miracle baby. Mark and Sarah had tried for years to conceive, enduring 3 miscarriages before Jacob finally arrived, healthy and perfect with his father's dark hair and his mother's bright blue eyes. I remembered the day they brought him home from the hospital, how Sarah couldn't stop staring at him, as if she couldn't believe he was real. "He's the best thing I've ever done," she'd told me once, when Jacob was about 2. We were watching him chase bubbles in their backyard, his chubby legs pumping furiously, his laughter echoing off the fence. Sometimes I look at him and can't breathe because I love him so much it hurts. And then, just after his 5th birthday, Jacob was gone. A family picnic at Lake Windermere. A moment of distraction. A child who had just learned to swim venturing too far from shore. By the time they realized he was missing, it was too late. After the funeral, Sarah seemed to fold into herself. She stopped teaching, stopped organizing family events, stopped taking photos. Mark threw himself into his work, staying late at the office, as if their empty house was too painful to face. They moved to a new home, away from the memories, but the distance between them grew. I'd been sure they would divorce, everyone was, but somehow they stayed together, existing in the same space like 2 planets in separate orbits, held together by the gravity of their shared loss, but never truly connecting. And now I understood where Sarah went every Sunday. Not to escape, not to meet someone else, but to grieve in the only way she knew how, by returning to the place that had taken her son and speaking to him in the only way left to her. The realization made me pull over to the side of the road, overcome with shame. Who was I to intrude on her grief? What right did I have to spy on her most vulnerable moments? I had always prided myself on being close to Mark, on being there for him after Jacob's death. But had I ever truly been there for Sarah? Had any of us? I thought back to the family dinners where we carefully avoided mentioning Jacob's name, thinking we were protecting Mark and Sarah from pain. But maybe our silence had only deepened their isolation. Maybe Sarah went to the lake because it was the only place she could speak her son's name aloud. When I finally got home, I sat in my driveway for a long time, wondering what to do next. Should I tell Mark what I'd seen? Should I pretend it never happened? Should I apologize to Sarah? None of the options seemed right. My phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Everything okay with you?" Sarah came home upset, said she wasn't feeling well. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could I possibly say? The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't focus, couldn't stop replaying the scene at the lake. Around noon, I drove to Mark and Sarah's house, rehearsing what I would say, though no words seemed adequate. But when I arrived, only Mark's car was in the driveway. Sarah had apparently left early, without telling him, where she was going. "She's been doing that a lot lately," Mark said as he let me in, his voice tinged with worry and resignation. "Just disappearing without explanation." We sat at their kitchen island, drinking coffee in uncomfortable silence. The house was immaculate, almost sterile. No photos on the walls, no magnets on the refrigerator, no evidence that a child had ever lived there. The only personal touch was a small potted plant on the windowsill, its leaves dusty from neglect. "I'm worried about her, Emma," Mark finally said, running a hand through his graying hair. At 42, my brother looked a decade older, the lines around his eyes deepened by grief. "She won't talk to me, won't see a therapist, just keeps saying she's fine, but she's not. Neither of us are." I wrapped my hands around my mug, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. "Have you ever asked her where she goes on Sundays?" Mark looked up sharply. "She goes fishing. She told me it helps her clear her head." "And you've never questioned that? That she never brings home any fish?" He shrugged, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "What are you getting at, Emma? That she's lying to me? That she's, what, having an affair or something?" The accusation in his tone made me flinch. "No, of course not. I think she might be going to the lake. To Windermere." The color drained from Mark's face. He set his mug down with a sharp click against the granite countertop. "Why would you say that? Why would she go there of all places?" I hesitated, knowing I was about to cross a line. "Because I followed her yesterday." Mark stared at me, disbelief and anger warring in his expression. "You did what?" "I was worried about her. About both of you. You barely talk about Jacob anymore." "Don't." Mark's voice was sharp, cutting through the air between us. "We agreed not to." "That's exactly the problem." I leaned forward, forcing myself to continue despite his glare. "You don't talk about him. Not with me, not with each other. It's like Jacob never existed, except he did, and Sarah goes to that lake every Sunday to remember him because she can't do it here." Mark pushed away from the counter, pacing the kitchen with agitated steps. "You had no right to follow her, no right to invade our privacy like that." "I know," I admitted, guilt washing over me again. "And I'll apologize to Sarah. But Mark, she was making paper boats and sending them out on the water. She was talking to him, wishing him happy birthday." Mark froze, his back to me. "Yesterday was May 12th. "Yes." "Jacob would have been 8. His voice cracked on the number. "Yes." He turned slowly, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "She never told me that's where she was going. All this time I thought—" "What did you think?" He shook his head, moving to the window to stare out at the neatly manicured backyard. No swing set, no toys scattered on the grass. "I thought she was trying to forget, to move on. I've been trying so hard to give her space, to not remind her of what we lost." "Maybe that's not what she needs," I said gently. "Maybe she needs to remember him. With you." Mark pressed his forehead against the glass, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I can. Every time I think about him, I can't breathe. I was supposed to be watching him that day. I was the one who taught him to swim. I was his father, and I failed him." The raw pain in his voice made my throat tighten. For 3 years, Mark had carried this guilt alone, just as Sarah had carried her grief. They were both drowning, separately, when they could have been holding each other up. "You didn't fail him, Mark. It was an accident." A terrible accident that wasn't anyone's fault. He turned to face me, his expression haunted. Then why does it feel like my punishment? Why does it feel like I deserve this pain? Before I could answer, the front door opened. Sarah stood in the entryway, her face pale, her eyes darting between Mark and me. She was still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice small and wary. Mark and I exchanged a glance, and I saw the decision in his eyes. After 3 years of avoidance, it was time for truth. "Emma told me where you go on Sundays," he said quietly. Sarah's eyes widened, first in shock, then in betrayal as she looked at me. "You had no right," she whispered, echoing her words from the lake. "I know," I said, standing up. "And I'm so sorry, Sarah. I was worried and I made a terrible mistake." She set her purse down with deliberate care, her movements stiff. "I think you should go now." I nodded, knowing I'd done enough damage. As I passed her on my way to the door, I paused. "He would have been a wonderful 8-year-old, I said softly, "with your kindness and Mark's laugh, and he would have wanted you both to be okay." Sarah's composure cracked, a small sound escaping her throat. I left quickly, closing the door behind me, giving them the privacy they deserved. Through the front window, I saw Mark take a tentative step toward his wife. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, then collapsed into his arms, both of them sinking to the floor in shared grief. I drove home with tears streaming down my face, praying I hadn't made everything worse. For the next week, I heard nothing from either Mark or Sarah. I called once, leaving an awkward voicemail that felt wholly inadequate. I sent a text apologizing again. But the silence stretched on, leaving me to wonder if I had irreparably damaged my relationship with both of them. Then, on Friday evening, my doorbell rang. Sarah stood on my porch, looking both determined and uncertain. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside wordlessly, heart pounding. She walked past me into the living room but remained standing, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as I'd known her. "Mark and I have been talking," she began, her voice steadier than I expected. "Really talking, for the first time in years. About Jacob. About what happened. About everything." I nodded, afraid to speak and break whatever fragile progress they'd made. "It wasn't easy," she continued, finally meeting my eyes. "But it was necessary. And while I'm still angry that you followed me, I also need to thank you for forcing us to face what we've been avoiding." Relief washed over me. "I really am sorry, Sarah. I was so worried and I handled it all wrong." She nodded, accepting my apology without quite forgiving me yet. "We want you to come with us on Sunday. To the lake." The request surprised me. "Are you sure? That seems like something private between you and Mark." "It is," she agreed. "But your family too, and Jacob loved his Aunt Emma." Her voice caught slightly on his name, but she pushed through. We thought maybe we could all remember him together." The invitation felt like both an olive branch and a test. "I'd be honored," I said. Sunday dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect spring morning that seemed to mock the solemnity of our purpose. I met Mark and Sarah at their house, and we drove to Lake Windermere together in silence. Sarah carried a small backpack, and Mark held a bundle of blue helium balloons, Jacob's favorite color. The lake was peaceful, with only a few early morning fishermen dotting the shore. Sarah led us to her spot, a small clearing with a good view of the water. She spread a blanket on the ground and began unpacking her backpack, a framed photo of Jacob, a small birthday cake with 8 candles, and a children's book, Where the Wild Things Are, that had been Jacob's favorite. "I usually read to him," she explained, her voice soft but no longer apologetic. "Every week, a different story he loved." Mark knelt beside her, placing the balloons at the corner of the blanket. With trembling hands, he pulled something from his pocket, a small, carved wooden boat. "I made this," he said. "Last night. I thought maybe we could send it out together." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she took the boat, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. He would have loved it." They looked at me expectantly, and I realized they were waiting for my contribution to this improvised ceremony. I hadn't known to bring anything, but then I remembered the small sketchbook in my purse. I always carried it for idle moments, And over the years, I'd drawn Jacob from memory many times, trying to preserve his image, afraid I'd forget the exact curve of his smile or the cowlick in his hair. I opened the book to a drawing I'd done just months after the accident. Jacob on Mark's shoulders at the zoo, both of them laughing as they pointed at the elephants. I'd captured the moment from a photo Sarah had taken, one of hundreds lost when they moved and packed away all reminders of their son. I have this, I said, showing them the sketch. And others. I've been drawing him all this time, afraid I'd forget what he looked like. Sarah took the sketchbook with reverent hands. You drew these? All these years you were remembering him too? I nodded, suddenly self-conscious. I didn't know if you'd want to see them. I didn't want to cause you more pain. Mark looked over Sarah's shoulder as she turned the pages slowly, each sketch revealing another moment of Jacob's short life, building a snowman, sleeping with his favorite stuffed elephant, splashing in a puddle with yellow rain boots. These are memories, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. Real memories that we've been trying to bury instead of cherish. Sarah closed the book and held it against her heart. Can we keep this? Just for today? I want him to see it. Of course, I said. It's yours to keep forever if you want. Together we created a birthday celebration for a boy who would never turn 8. Sarah lit the candles, and we sang Happy Birthday in soft, wavering voices that carried across the water. Mark read from the book, doing all the monster voices the way Jacob had loved. I told stories about being his aunt, how he always asked me to draw dinosaurs, how he insisted on calling me Auntie M, like in The Wizard of Oz, even though no one else in the family used that nickname. And Sarah spoke directly to her son, telling him about her weeks, about the new flowers in the garden, about how much she missed him every single day. She did this without shame or hesitation, and for the first time, I understood that this weekly ritual had been keeping her alive, not holding her back. When it was time, Mark carefully placed his wooden boat in the water. Sarah added a paper note inside, something private between mother and son. I contributed a small sketch I'd torn from my book, of Jacob's hands holding a dandelion puff. Together, the three of us pushed the boat out into the lake, watching as it drifted slowly away from shore. Goodbye for now, sweet boy, Sarah whispered. We'll be back next Sunday. Mark released the balloons one by one, each carrying a message written on its ribbon. We watched until they were just blue dots against the vast sky. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something had changed between Mark and Sarah. They moved in sync now, their hands occasionally brushing, small glances communicating volumes. The wall between them hadn't fully crumbled, but cracks had formed, letting light through. Thank you for sharing this with me, I said as we walked back to the car. I know how private it is. Sarah linked her arm through mine, surprising me. Family shouldn't have secrets this big, she said. Not anymore. Mark nodded in agreement, falling into step beside us. We're thinking of starting a support group for parents who've lost children. There's nothing like it in our area, and the need is, well, unfortunately, it's there. That's a wonderful idea, I said, genuinely moved by their desire to transform their pain into something that could help others. We'd like your help, Sarah added. Those drawings, they're a way of remembering that isn't just painful. Other parents might want something similar. The request took me by surprise. You want me to draw for other families? Mark smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. Only if you want to, but your art, it brought Jacob back to us in a way photographs couldn't. It showed us he could still be part of our lives without tearing us apart. I felt tears prick my eyes. I'd be honored. As we reached the car, Sarah hesitated, then pulled me into a tight hug. I'm still mad at you for following me, she whispered in my ear. But I'm also grateful. So let's call it even. I laughed through my tears, hugging her back. Deal. The ride home was different from the tense silence of our arrival. Mark and Sarah held hands over the center console, and we talked about Jacob openly, funny stories, bittersweet memories, the little things that made him uniquely himself. There was pain in the remembering, but also a healing warmth that had been absent for too long. When they dropped me off, Mark walked me to my door. You know, he said quietly, we've been thinking about trying again. For another baby. The news stunned me. Really? Are you sure you're ready? He looked back at the car, where Sarah waited, her face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before the accident. No one's ever ready for any of this, the joy or the pain. But we can't live in fear anymore. Jacob taught us how to love. We don't want that lesson to be lost. I hugged my brother tightly, feeling his strength returning. He'd be so proud of you both. We know, Mark said simply. And for the first time, I believed he truly did. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn Sunday, I joined Mark and Sarah at the lake again. These visits had become a family tradition now, not every week, but often enough to keep Jacob's memory alive and honored. Sometimes other people came too. My parents, Mark and Sarah's friends, even a few families from the support group they'd started. Today was special though. Sarah stood at the edge of the water, her hand resting on the small but distinct curve of her belly. 5 months pregnant with a little girl they'd already decided to name Hope. We wanted him to be the first to know, Sarah explained as she released a pink balloon into the sky. Well, after you, of course. I smiled, remembering how they'd told me the news first, making me promise to be as involved in this child's life as I had been in Jacob's. There would be no replacing him. That was understood by all of us. Hope would know about her big brother through our stories, through my drawings, through the birthday celebrations at the lake. Mark joined us, wrapping an arm around Sarah's shoulders. Do you think he approves? He asked, only half joking. I looked out across the water, remembering the little boy who had loved so fiercely and been so fiercely loved in return. I think, I said carefully, that Jacob would want nothing more than for you both to be happy again. Sarah leaned into Mark's embrace, her free hand reaching for mine. We're getting there, she said, one Sunday at a time. As we stood together at the edge of the lake that had taken so much from us, I realized that Sarah's fishing trips had never been about escaping reality. They had been about maintaining a connection that death couldn't sever, about finding a way to carry unbearable grief by sharing it with the wind and water. And now, by sharing it with each other, that burden had somehow become lighter for all of us. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the lake's surface. In that moment, I could almost believe Jacob was there with us, his spirit as bright and boundless as the sky above. Some might call it faith. Others, the power of memory. But standing there with Mark and Sarah, watching them begin to rebuild their lives while still honoring what they had lost, I called it love, the kind that transcends time, space, and even death itself. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was what Sarah had been doing all along, during those solitary Sunday mornings by the lake. Not fishing for something she had lost, but rather casting her love out into the universe, trusting it would somehow find its way to where it needed to go.